Sorry, may I be recognized?
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you. Mr. President, I first of all want to thank my colleague from Georgia, who is the ranking member Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So Senator Chambliss has seen so much in terms of the real threats that we face from terrorists in this country, and I appreciate his leadership on ensuring that America remains safe, his leadership on this issue of ensuring that the Guantanamo detainees are not released to get back in the fight against us, to attack not only our soldiers, but us and our allies. And I guess I would start with this, is the defense authorization right now, as it stands, and even the side-by-side offered by Chairman Levin, that it's a dramatic change from current policy of where we are now with regard to Guantanamo and the transfer of Guantanamo detainees internationally into the United States of America between last year's defense authorization and this year's defense authorization. So what has changed? The only thing that has changed is the fact that the re-engagement rate of those who are suspected of having been released, who have been released from Guantanamo and are suspected or who actually have re-engaged in the fight against us has increased, not decreased. And yet the status quo of where we are right now, if our amendment that was just described by Senator Chambliss is not adopted, Amendment 2255, is that we would weaken what is required to be certified from people who are released from Guantanamo. So in other words, the defense authorization and the proposal offered by Chairman Levin would weaken the national security waivers that are currently in place, the standards in which you have to meet before someone is transferred from Guantanamo to another country, even though the re-engagement rate has actually increased. What else would it do? It would now allow the potential for transferring Guantanamo detainees to the United States of America. And that would include Guantanamo detainees potentially like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that Senator Chambliss referenced. He is the mastermind of September 11th, the key player behind the attacks on our country on September 11th. And so we're going to allow the potential that he could be transferred to the United States of America. In addition to that, there is allowance for potential transfer to the country of Yemen. And as Senator Chambliss has talked about, the country of Yemen is a place where where Al-Qaeda is centered in the Arabian Peninsula. But not only that, in Yemen, there have actually been instances where we have seen prison breaks in Yemen. In fact, it's a very destabilized place. In June, I asked the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about Yemen, and he assessed it to be the most dangerous. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is located in Yemen, is the most dangerous Al-Qaeda affiliate. Yemen, again, when we look at Yemen, there have been breaks from detention facilities there. As Senator Chambliss described, the 2009 Christmas Day bomber received his training in Yemen. And we have Guantanamo detainees who have actually been captured, who we've let out previously, captured, killed, or spotted in Yemen. These included Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's former second-in-command, Saeed al-Shihiri, and Ibrahim Suleiman al-Rubash, alleged to be one of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's main religious leaders. So we have instances where in Yemen, there actually have been Al-Qaeda terrorists, some who have joined the leadership, back with the leadership of Al-Qaeda after we've released them from Guantanamo and they've gotten back in. And so I would ask, why are we lifting the prohibition on transfer to Yemen when there still is not a certification that can be made that they won't re-engage and that Yemen even can detain these individuals or account for them in a place where it is the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula? Let me just say that where we are right now is very important in terms of the protection of our country. as Senator Chambliss mentioned, the administration has been so caught up in not wanting to transfer anyone into Guantanamo that we are left with a situation where we are potentially losing valuable intelligence to protect our country. And let me talk about that. If we captured tomorrow the current head of al-Qaeda, Anwar al-Awlaki, excuse me, I want to correct that again, Zawahiri, what would we do with him? Are we going to bring him to the United States? Or should we bring him to a secure detention facility at Guantanamo? Because the legal questions that are raised by this, in terms of if we bring him to the United States, are we going to tell him you have the right to remain silent, even though he is the current head of al-Qaeda? Shouldn't the first priority be to collect information, to protect our country, to know what they're planning, to know what they're up to know what can happen next? But right now where we are is that we have the example that was given of Warsame, who was a terrorist that was captured overseas, and instead of being brought to Guantanamo, he was put on a ship for approximately 60 days, and then brought to the United States, where he was told you have the right to remain silent. Even worse, recently there was the capture of a man named al-Libi, and al-Libi actually had been involved in the beginning. In fact, the director of the FBI recently said before the Homeland Security Committee he was a founder of al-Qaeda with Osama bin Laden. We captured him in Libya, and rather than bring him to Guantanamo Bay, he was put on a ship for only a week. A week. Then he was transferred to New York City and read his Miranda rights. This is someone who is alleged to have committed the bombings against the embassies in Africa in 1998, but someone who has decades involvement in al-Qaeda and who was only interrogated on a ship for a week rather than being brought to Guantanamo and fully interrogated to make sure that we maximize the gathering of intelligence to protect our country. And so now the administration wants to close Guantanamo, and the alternative offered by Chairman Levin is that they should come up with a plan of where we would put these detainees in the United States of America. Well, I guess the question is, how come we've had to wait this long, first of all, to even have some information of what the plan would be with what to do? But second of all, why would we want the most dangerous terrorists in the world, some of them, to come to the United States of America when we have a secure detention facility at Guantanamo? Why would we risk the legal questions that will be raised if we bring them to the United States of, do we have to read the Miranda? If we capture Zawahiri and we have no Guantanamo Bay to bring him to, do we have to read him Miranda because he's in the United States of America so we can't gather intelligence to protect our country? How much does it cost to make sure that the people are secure in the area where these terrorists are being brought? And by the way, we don't even know where they'll be brought, because the alternative amendment, all it says is that they have to come up with a plan of where to put these terrorists rather than at Guantanamo. And we don't know. We have no way. The amendment does not provide for us as a Congress to approve this plan. It just says that the Secretary of Defense has to come up with the plan, and then he may take actions to transfer the detainees and allowing them to be transferred to the United States of America. So stay tuned if the Guantanamo detainees are coming to your neighborhood, because we don't know. And that is why it's important that the prohibitions stay in place in the absence of any plan. But why should we bring them to the United States of America, given the dangerous nature of who they are? And also, why wouldn't we want to have a secure facility to ensure that we have a place to interrogate terrorists, to make sure that we can maximize the information and understand what they know to prevent attacks against our country? Otherwise, we'll continue to have a situation where terrorists like al-Libi are only interrogated for a week, and then they are told you have the right to remain silent, and no terrorist should hear that right. Let me just say that what this provision does is it puts back in place the requirements that the administration has to meet a strong national security waiver before they can transfer to third-party countries. And so what was taken out? Let me just tell you what was taken out, which is important. The way they have weakened the waiver of transferring people of the requirement that the administration must meet before transferring from Guantanamo to third-party countries is they've taken out language that requires the Secretary of Defense currently to certify that a country is not a state sponsor of terrorism or a foreign terrorist organization. So now there's no longer a requirement that we even have to certify that. So we will now, if our amendment is not passed and the alternative is passed, if there is a country or an entity that's a state sponsor of terrorism or a foreign terrorist organization, then they can transfer there. They've also taken out the provision that would consider whether we have previously transferred a detainee to the country and yet the detainee has gotten back into the fight, has re-engaged. So in other words, if we made a mistake in the past and transferred someone out of Guantanamo to a country like Yemen and they weren't able to secure the individual and that individual gets back in the fight, that was a consideration they had to take into account before they could transfer to that country. That is now being removed from the national security waiver, making it much weaker and easier to transfer to countries that are not only potential sponsors of terrorism, but are also countries where we've already had a history of transferring detainees who have gotten back again in the fight against us and our soldiers. And by the way, we've seen some of these detainees show up in places like Afghanistan against our soldiers. We have seen these detainees attempt to attack us and our allies, and we cannot risk weakening the provisions to say we're going to transfer them and take our risks that they can do that again. We should keep the current law in place. And the administration has been able to meet the current law. They have transferred 6 detainees this year, so they do not have an excuse to say that we can't transfer anyone because they've already been able to transfer people. Mr. President, I would like to be able to ask my colleague from Georgia a question about these provisions.
Without objection.
Senator Chambliss, if we eliminate Guantanamo, in other words, under this proposal, they would be permitted to transfer people to the United States of America, or new captures be brought to the United States of America instead of to a facility like Guantanamo. What are the risks we face in terms of losing valuable intelligence that we need to protect our country?
Well, you know, the very best tool that we have been able to utilize from an intelligence gathering standpoint is the information that we gather from individuals who were involved in the crime or involved in the planning of the crime. And that's the case whether it's an ordinary burglary or a bank robbery, or in the case that we're talking about today, the planning and the scheming of the carrying out of what happened on September 11 as terrorist activity, as well as terrorist activity prior to that, such as the USS Cole bombing and others, as well as terrorist activity against the United States subsequent to September 11, as well as the detainees who are at Guantanamo today who were captured on the battlefield in Afghanistan. We have gone through each one of the detainees who were involved in specific incidents or who are battlefield captured detainees, and we've been able to gather intelligence for them that simply we would not have been able to get from anyone else. Now, a lot of times what you have is when you interrogate detainees, you'll know the answer to the question that you're going to ask them. And sometimes it's information that was gleaned from detainee X who was with detainee Y that you're now interrogating. And by virtue of the fact that you know information that you've already gleaned from detainee X, you can ask terrorist Y about it or detainee Y, and you're going to get not only verification of what the first interrogated detainee tells you, but all of a sudden you're going to have an expanded story because this guy says, well, he knows this. and that is the case, so I may as well go ahead and tell him the rest of this. That's kind of the way that the interrogation process goes. And what's happened at Guantanamo is that, you know, it's been there for a number of years now. September 11 is unfortunately 12 years behind us now. But we are still gathering information from detainees at Guantanamo who have been there from the very first day it opened on acts of violence that have occurred, but more significantly, on the makeup of Al-Qaeda, on who the members are, where they're located, where their headquarters were versus where they think their headquarters might be. There's just such a valuable source of information to be gleaned from individuals one-on-one in the interrogation process that you simply can't get otherwise. Let me refer a question back to the senator from New Hampshire. You're a prosecutor. You were the Attorney General of New Hampshire, and you prosecuted any number of criminal cases over the years as Attorney General, some including very violent cases. You're familiar with the criminal process, obviously. You're familiar with individuals who have been convicted of crimes, who in some instances were let out of jail when their time was up or whatever, and those individuals re-engaged in criminal activity. Much like what we are seeing at Guantanamo today. You and I both talked about the recidivism rate being very high. What is your opinion as a longtime prosecutor relative to these 164 individuals who remain at Guantanamo Bay today with regard to what you think is the possibility or the probability of their re-engaging in the fight because of their long-term detention at Guantanamo?
Well, I would say that we have to go from the evidence that we have before us, where we have a 29% re-engagement rate. And let's face it, the easier decisions were made first in terms of who should be released. And now we have some very hardcore individuals who are there. And if we already have a 29% re-engagement rate of them getting back in the fight against us as terrorists, then we face a grave risk of some of the most hardened individuals getting, if we transfer them, or we lessen the standard for transfer, which is really what this is doing. It's taking away the issues that I talked about, the consideration of countries that we've already transferred to, but people have gotten back in. It's making it easier to transfer and weaker in terms of the national security requirements that have to be met. And I'm worried that they will get back in and then harm us and our interests, because we already have a history of that. I wanted to ask you, Senator Chambliss, some have said that the cost issue is the reason we should just close Guantanamo, but to your knowledge, has anyone really done the cost estimate of all the considerations that would have to be taken into account in the United States, and also the security interests of the people of this country of transferring these terrorists to the United States? And finally, I would also say the risk we face of losing intelligence if they have to be Mirandized and things like that, that's a huge cost in terms of protecting our country, is it not?
Well, it certainly is, and I think you and I need to be very clear with our colleagues here as well as the American public. When it comes to cost of detaining terrorists who carried out the horrific attacks of September 11, I think the American people are well prepared to use their taxpayer dollars to house guys like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is admitted to planning the September 11 attacks. And if we house him in a prison here inside the United States, he gets Mirandized. I'm sure the first thing he's going to do is to get a lawyer, and you and I are both lawyers, and we'd be foolish not to tell our client to hush up, don't talk anymore. And that's exactly what he would do. So the cost of detaining individuals who ripped this country apart on September 11, 2001 is really not a consideration in my mind from the standpoint of whether or not we should house those folks for the rest of their lives.
Right, and if we were to lose, for example, valuable intelligence from, if we were to get Zawahiri tomorrow, or if we had captured Osama bin Laden instead of killing him and were able to interrogate him, isn't that the value cannot be placed on that in terms of preventing future attacks and understanding how Al-Qaeda is planning things to prevent future harm to Americans. Is that right?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And if you do bring them to the United States, I'll guarantee you that's the last bit of interrogation of any of those individuals that we'll ever see. And you mentioned bin Laden. I remember at a hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee where the issue of bin Laden came up during a presentation by one of the current administration Secretary of Defense, I asked the question with regard to Guantanamo Bay. I said, if you captured bin Laden tomorrow, what would you do with him? And to his credit, the Secretary of Defense looked me straight in the eye and said, gee, Senator, I guess we'd have to send him to Guantanamo. And he was right. There's nowhere in America that where bin Laden would have been welcomed in the county jail or some federal institution. I don't think there's any question about that. And the 164 that are there today, in my mind, fit in that same category. Some of these individuals have never said one word to an interrogator since they've been there. Some of them, and most of them, in fact, have been very open, and we still gather intelligence from them. But if we transfer them to the United States, that's the last we'll hear from them.
Thank you.
Senator, if you have the floor now.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Yeah. I've been listening to the discussion. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that's been said. Now, the amendment we're going to be voting on is parts of 3 different amendments. I was one of them, and the 2 of you. And one thing that hasn't been said is the part that I put in there on striking the provision that permits the transfer of detainees to the United States for emergency medical treatment, which is just another way of getting them there. This obsession the president has.
The time has just expired.
To ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes.
Without objection.
And the other thing is that when you transfer someone here for incarceration purposes, isn't it true that these are not criminals? These are terrorists. And what terrorists do for a living is train other people to be terrorists. And to commingle them in our prison system is something that would be a great danger to this country. And that's, you agree that's one of the major reasons that we want to keep them from the United States?
I would agree with the ranking member Inhofe. I want to thank him for his leadership, absolutely, because these are not common criminals. And these are not people who have robbed a bank. These are people who have attacked our country and who seek to get other people to attack our country. And that's for a reason why we wouldn't want to mingle them with criminals or bring them to the United States so they can be told they have the right to remain silent, because we have to protect our country by knowing what they know.
Parliamentary